Okay, ready? All right, so this bone in the front of the, forms your forehead is called the frontal bone. These two back here are called parietal bones. So you have one here, you have one right here. On the side, right here, you have the temporal bone. And then the back of the head, you have the occipital bone. It's all of this bone right in here. Now, there is a bone right under my thumb. It's about that big too, right there, called the sphenoid. From the inside of the skull, the sphenoid is actually a very large bone. It's what we call the butterfly or bat-shaped bone. But on the outside, that right there is all that you can see from it. Now, each of these skull bones are separated from each other by what we call sutures. So if you look on the skull, you can see this jagged line that goes all the way across here. So you have four different ones. You have four different sutures. This one that goes across here, if you think back to chapter 1 where we had our planes, the plane that divided the body into a front and a back was called frontal or coronal. And so this is actually the coronal suture right here. Then we had a plane that divided the body into a right and a left side. And so this one right here that goes down the middle is called the sagittal suture. Then we have this one. It divides the parietals from the occipital. It basically forms kind of an upside down U. And so that one is called the lambdoid suture. And then on the side of the face, side of the head, this one's a little harder to see because they've cut the skull and it's smoothed it out. But this suture went across here all the way up to here. And so this one separates temporal from parietal and is called the squamous or squamosal suture. All right, so starting with, we're going to look at the temporal bone. With the temporal bone, you have this blunt projection right here called the mastoid process. This really sharp one here is called the styloid process. That canal or that opening right there is called the external auditory meatus. Remember, a meatus is a canal-like passageway. And then this sharp projection coming off of here is the zygomatic process. Okay. Now, if we look in the eye socket, now you can probably see this little bone right here with the hole in it. If you look back here, right behind it, that bone that's about the size of a nickel, that bone right there is called the ethmoid bone, E-T-H-M-O-I-D, ethmoid. That one is what we call the deepest of the skull bones. That one right there with the little hole in it is called the lacrimal bone, and that hole is for your tear ducts. That's where they fit, and that's why they're there. This bone right here that forms the bridge of your nose is called the nasal bone. All right, and then we have, of course, the mandible, which is the bottom jawbone. It's all of this right here. Then we have the upper jawbone, all of this, which is called the maxilla. Now, in the front of the skull, you have three sets of holes. You have two above the eye, two below the eye, and two in the chin. The two above the eye are called supraorbital foramen. The two below the eye are called infraorbital foramen. And the two in the chin, if you think back to chapter 1 again, the region of the chin is called mental. So those are called mental foramen. This area where the teeth and the bone meet, so basically just this ridge where your teeth and bone are on both the mandible and the maxilla, is called the alveolar margin. Some books call it the alveolar process. Okay, now there's one structure right here that you actually don't have to know for your test, but I wanted to point this out. This process right here that sticks up off the maxilla is also called a zygomatic process, just like this one over here on the temporal bone was. But this bone that sits in between them right here is called the zygomatic bone. So you have zygomatic process, zygomatic process, zygomatic bone is here. That is what we call your cheekbone too. All right, so inside the nasal cavity, this is what we always call our nasal septum. It is formed by two different bones. The bottom portion, also we call it the inferior portion, is called the vomer, V-O-M-E-R. So it's this plow-shaped bone in the middle. The top portion is formed from part of the ethmoid bone called the perpendicular plate. So basically the top half is perpendicular plate, the bottom half is basically the vomer. These little curved bones on the inside, so right here, and then you have one here, you also have one over here, and you have one on this side. You also have two up here behind the nasal bones that you can't see. Those are all called nasal conchae. This very bottom one down here is called the inferior nasal conchae. Those help warm the air whenever you breathe in through your nose. Helps to warm it so it doesn't burn. It also has other actions as well. Okay, one of the pictures in your book, they take the mandible off of the skull. So we take this off and we're looking at the bottom portion. Okay, so this is what we call the ventral view. This is the bottom portion of the skull that faces the ground. This really big hole right here is called the foramen magnum. Coming down from the foramen magnum, there's a crest of bone that pretty much right up here, it's going to split. It's called the external occipital protuberance. On either side of the foramen magnum, these two processes here that stick up, those are called occipital condyles. Now up here where the mouth is, this portion that has the teeth in it, that's called the palatine process. And then basically, if you kind of find where about the last tooth is, just this section of bone right in here, all the way across here, is the palatine bone. So you have palatine process up front, palatine bone in the back. All right, another picture is, we're going to put the jaw back on. Not that it's going to matter. But they take the skull and they cut it. And they cut it all the way around, and then they take the top off. And when they do that, you look down inside of here, okay? So the front of the face is up here, so you can see the face right here. And so we're looking down into the skull. This little ridge of bone right here is called the crista galli. On either side, those grooves are called the cribriform plate. These right here are called, let me go back to here. These two structures are a part of the ethmoid, the one that we said was the deepest. Now, if you look across this center portion, this region right here, it looks like a butterfly or a bat. That's the sphenoid. If you remember from the outside, it was that bone right there that you could, it was about the size of my thumb, okay? So it wasn't very large, but from the inside, it's all of this right here, okay? This and this, these little wings are called lesser wings of the sphenoid, and then basically the floor right here, that's called the greater wing of the sphenoid. Sitting in between those two, that little square region right here in the middle is called the sella turcica. And then of course you can still see the foramen magnum. This is from the other view. This is from the inside instead of from the outside. Okay, I think that's it.